By Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and a little while ago on Twitter, I saw a bunch of people, well, I say a bunch of people, a few people, discussing the idea that Aragorn has no social skills. And part of this was based on the idea, and it was largely a joke, that every time he's introducing himself to somebody, he's like giving his whole image and talking about this really awesome sword he's carrying. But the other thing that came up in it, which I thought was an interesting note, is that he never discusses the fact that he knows Bilbo, and he never tells Frodo that Bilbo is in Rivendell. And this was kind of odd. Well, it is a little odd, but it's also kind of odd that Gandalf never does the same thing either, despite knowing it, presumably. And so the thought came into my head, we do kind of need to explain this a little bit. In Aragorn's case, this is based on a couple of places where presumably he could have mentioned Bilbo if he wanted to get himself in with Frodo, or just, tell something Frodo would want to know. So one of those is when he first meets Frodo, of course, and he doesn't say that he's Gandalf's friend, and he doesn't say that he knows Bilbo. Now, this is partially explainable by the fact that, as Aragorn himself tells Frodo, the enemy has set traps for me before. I needed to know who you were before I revealed too much about myself. So he's not just going to go off and tell everything he knows, assuming that Frodo is who he seems to be. But the other one is, at one point in their trip from Bree to Rivendell, Sam actually he actually recites lines from the poem about Gil-galad going to Mordor and fighting Sauron, which he says Bilbo taught him. Aragorn follows this up with a remark that Bilbo must have translated it. I never knew that. You might tend to assume from Aragorn's comments that he knows, or at least knows of, Bilbo, but it actually doesn't follow. It is sort of implied, but in context it would make sense that he would say what he says even if he knew nothing of Bilbo at all. Because what the conversation goes like this. After Sam recites the bit of poetry, it says the others turned in amazement, for the voice was Sam's. "Don't stop," said Merry. "That's all I know," stammered Sam, blushing. "I learned it from Mr. Bilbo when I was a lad. He used to tell me tales like that, knowing how I was always one for hearing about elves. It was Mr. Bilbo as taught me my letters. He was mighty book-learned, was dear old Mr. Bilbo, and he wrote poetry. He wrote what I have just said. He did not make it up," said Strider. "It is part of the lay that is called the Fall of Gil-galad, which is in an ancient tongue. Bilbo must have translated it. I never knew that." So, in context, Aragorn is really just saying what you attribute to Bilbo is actually much older, which means Bilbo must have translated it, which I didn't know. Now, him saying, "I didn't know that," does kind of lead you to think that he's saying, "I would have thought I would have known that," but it doesn't necessarily imply it. So it is possible here that Aragorn is saying nothing more than, as far as I knew, the only version of this was the Elven language version. So it doesn't really actually say anything about, how well he knows Bilbo or anything like that. Although it kind of touches on it. But the interesting thing about this, of course, is he never mentions Bilbo other than in this context, never says he knows anything about him, and certainly never says he's in Rivendell. Gandalf likewise never tells Frodo that Bilbo is in Rivendell, and presumably Gandalf knows that he is. Presumably Aragorn knows that he is, because Aragorn is in and out of Rivendell fairly regularly, and Bilbo has been there for a good while. And of course Bilbo knows him really well, and probably only from meeting him in Rivendell. He probably wouldn't have met him on his trip beyond Rivendell to Erebor and back. But Gandalf, when he's talking to Frodo in the Shadows of the Past chapter and afterwards, when he's getting Frodo to make up his own mind and, and then eventually tells him to make for Rivendell, he never ever mentions Bilbo at all, which is interesting. You could understand why he wouldn't mention Bilbo up front, because he's probably trying to avoid giving Frodo some kind of a motive that isn't really pertinent to what he needs to decide. He wants Frodo to decide what to do with the ring, absent other considerations, which of course is a little bit foolish in the sense that Frodo is already thinking about following after Bilbo anyway, but and he's even hoping that he might find Bilbo at Rivendell. But even after he makes the decision, Gandalf never seems to tell him that he's there. By the time that Frodo arrives and then wakes up and finds out that Bilbo is in Rivendell, it seems to him a genuine surprise, which means even if we assume there are off-camera conversations that we don't know anything about because Tolkien just didn't write every single bit of dialogue that might have happened, none of them discuss the fact that Bilbo was in Rivendell. So why is this exactly? What is the reason that all these people that would know about Bilbo's presence in Rivendell and would know that this would be important to Frodo never actually mention it to Frodo? Well, you could kind of handwave Aragorn away by saying he doesn't know that Frodo is out to find Bilbo and doesn't really, he's not trying to, once he gets Frodo's trust, he doesn't need to mention Bilbo, so why would he mention it? Gandalf's is a little harder to explain because Gandalf, of course, knows that Frodo loves Bilbo and would love to see him again. And so it's a little bit weirder that Gandalf wouldn't mention him. But in both cases, it's still a little odd. I mean, you would think in all the time that he spends, both with Gandalf in the Shadows of the Past chapter, and between that and when Gandalf finally sets out and then doesn't return, and then the time that he spends with Strider in the wilderness, you'd think the topic of Bilbo would come up eventually. I mean, it just seems like something that would almost have to happen. So why aren't they telling Frodo about Bilbo? And why doesn't Aragorn talk about how well he knows him, and why doesn't he tell him that he's in Rivendell? Honestly, it feels a lot like both of them are intentionally trying to create a surprise situation for Frodo. And this is kind of a thing that I've always believed a little bit, but never thought about the Aragorn aspect of it because it just never occurred to me. But Gandalf, at least, I always kind of assumed in some way was trying to set up the meeting in such a way that it would be a pleasant surprise for Frodo rather than, oh yeah, and Bilbo's going to be there, so that'll be great too. And it kind of jives with what Gandalf will tell Frodo much later on at the end of the story almost, when they're all waiting for Arwen to arrive at Minas Tirith for the wedding with Aragorn, and Gandalf tells them, don't, there's going to be some things that have been planned that we don't want to spoil because it would spoil the surprise. He doesn't use those words exactly, but it's basically the same idea. So we kind of already know that Gandalf, and not just Gandalf, but Aragorn himself, because he's also one of the ones keeping the secret about his upcoming marriage to Arwen, at least keeping it from the hobbits. Both of them already have this idea of, we like to plan things that are going to be awesome and not necessarily tell everybody about everything in advance so that we can amaze them and, get the whole ooh-ah reaction, right? And given that we also hear that Aragorn and Gandalf are very alike in a lot of ways, we can see why maybe Gandalf might have rubbed off on Aragorn in that way. But for purposes of this particular discussion, I think what's going on is Gandalf actually wants Frodo to make it to Rivendell, not knowing that he will find Bilbo there, and then be enormously pleasantly surprised that Bilbo is actually there. And you can imagine even that at some point he might have told Aragorn in the past, by the way, if Frodo ever makes it to Rivendell, or, if you ever run into him and he's on his way to Rivendell, don't let him know about Bilbo being there. It'll be a cool surprise. But even if he didn't explicitly do this, you could even imagine Aragorn doing the same thing on his own initiative, basically thinking, Frodo's going to be really excited when he gets there and finds out that Bilbo's there. I'm not going to spoil that surprise. Because, like I said, we already know that he and Gandalf kind of think along these same lines. So, I think really what's going on is not that he is just completely, he or Gandalf is just completely like, it doesn't matter to Frodo, I mean, this is completely socially awkward, whatever. Like he's some kind of sociopath who doesn't care about what Frodo is interested in or wants to know or anything like that. I think it's actually legitimately both Gandalf and Aragorn, maybe in concert or just independently, decided we want to surprise Frodo. We think it's going to be really cool when he shows up in Rivendell and finds out that Bilbo's there, despite the fact that we never told him that. Which, of course, the fact that neither of them told him that would lead him to wonder whether it was even true and therefore create the surprise. So that's my theory on why neither Gandalf nor Aragorn ever tell Frodo why, that Bilbo is there or anything really about Bilbo at all. What do you think? Do you think there's another explanation for this? Do you think, maybe that Aragorn really is just kind of a dunce when it comes to social situations and that's why he never mentions Bilbo? Or do you have some alternative theory that hasn't been raised at all? I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts on this, because this is one of those things where it's kind of odd and needs some kind of explanation. And my explanation is admittedly biased by the fact that I've kind of already assumed it for a long time with regard to Gandalf, and it, just seems to also kind of naturally fit with Aragorn. But that may just be me hanging on to an old assumption without, really considering all the evidence, because, it's not like I read through the entirety of The Lord of the Rings to prepare for this video just to make sure my theory was airtight. So if you've got an alternate theory, I'd be interested in hearing it, but this is mine. And if you enjoyed this kind of thing, then make sure you like and share the video and subscribe to my channel, whichever platform you're watching me on. If you're on YouTube, make sure you click the bell icon so that you don't miss any future notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions on a weekly basis. And check out all the other social and support links in the description below. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour, Robert Kindling, Stephen Clayton, and Spud.